Hello. On this, the inaugural episode of Educated Guess with Sam and Jordan, we are going to talk about the possibility that the universe is teeming with life. And down here on Earth, we might not be as special as we think. We'll start by exploring ancient belief systems which go back thousands of years with those who shared creation stories of the Earth being seeded with the cosmos. And then I'll propose means by which these ancient origin stories could occur within the realm of our current understanding. And we'll take some creative liberties along the way and finish the discussion by having the discussion, should we start preparing dinner for our cosmic neighbors or should we start getting a bit afraid? Anyway,
Sounds
hello,
good.
Sam.
Hello, Jordan.
How are you today?
Not bad. It sounds like you've prepared quite an interesting discussion for us. Sounds good.
Oh, yeah. Some of this, comes around of a lot of the things in the media and the science news at the moment is that there's discussion around life on Venus and ancient or lakes under the polar caps of Mars. And it's one of those things that I think is starting to get into the realms of commonplace media, which is there life in our solar system? And what does that mean if there's life throughout our solar system? Does that mean it will be throughout the galaxy? So that's where I guess the topic come from today. Can I say you had much thought or experience? So I guess we probably should discuss the dynamic here. Is that I've done the research and I've looked through, but I would say that I'm the learning and you're the learned. So I'm going to.
Well, it's funny you should say that because I was debating a cute little tagline, which was something like, I'm educated, he's guess. But then it occurred to me, no, actually, it's the other way around. He's done the education recently and I'll be guessing, but my guessing is more educated. Does that make sense?
You've spent a few more years learning things, and I'm just learning them recently, and try to meet somewhere in the middle of someone who knows things and someone who's trying to figure things out.
Yeah, I'm an old man who's spent a long time accumulating a lot of semi-useful knowledge, and Jordan is my young friend.
Well, young is relative, but yes. So I suppose the first thing I want to is just why even bother talking about like where did this come into my mind, and perhaps you can share where it came into your mind. The idea of things being around for a lot longer than perhaps we started, perhaps like what we would generally think. So if I think back to one of the things that I've done in my life is studied biology and molecular biology. And one of the things that I guess gets into my mind is, the idea of where did it all start? Where did life start? The idea of like, the sludge that had life come out of
The
it.
primordial soup.
Yeah, the primordial soup. Was that the bottom of oceans or hot springs or or even like the idea that perhaps where this idea comes from is that life is just one of the things that meteors drop on our doorstep.
Well, I've always been aware of the idea that life came from somewhere else because it's an idea I grew up with, but or certainly the main idea I grew up with was that God put it here, basically, and that's an idea that would be familiar to anyone with a religious background, and maybe even a lot of people that aren't religious. But I also came across it in science fiction, the idea of life being scattered across the cosmos and maybe even put there deliberately by some other alien species, or maybe meteors brought it. But it always seemed to me that you still had the problem of explaining how life came about in the first place.
Yeah. And I guess the something that's really like it plays on my mind a lot is the idea that we're 13 billion years into this universe. If I was to say, come up with a time in the future, and I said the year 26 billion, like that's so far away that I wouldn't even, I would say a million years in the future or a billion years in the future. The idea of saying 13 billion years in the future.
Well, what's the estimated shelf life of the current situation we're in?
Oh, trillions of years. We
Okay.
got some time.
Oh, that's good.
We got some time. But the idea of 13 billion years is a pretty long time. And if humanity somehow, holds on and doesn't burn this planet up before we get off it, I couldn't imagine how far we'd get in 13 billion years. I feel like it'd be pretty far.
Sure.
And that idea for, that's an intelligent species. What about one that was just flying through the cosmos accidentally? I know that before we were just prepping for this, and you said cosmic weeds. I like that. Maybe life is
Mm.
a cosmic weed,
Hmm.
just going from planet to planet, doing its thing. But 13 billion years is such a phenomenally long time that it's that the idea of that perhaps when we didn't start at 13 billion years into the time scale is an interesting one that I wanted to explore. So yeah.
Well, wait. So the fact that the universe has been around that long, or ours, suggests to you that more life could have developed in that time than just us.
Well, I mean, we'll get into this a bit later, but the idea of that the life on Earth only started a couple of 100 million years after Earth. Like, well, evidence for the early signs of life on Earth is a couple 100 million years after Earth was formed. If it only took us a couple of 100 million years, what happens in that 13 billion years before when all the other planets existed? Uh,
Oh, I see.
you know,
I mean, you are leaving out the enormous stretch of time between the very first theoretical life and us. Of course, it's
and us, yes,
an enormous stretch between those two things. And as you'd be aware, we are just the last few layers of the layer cake of everything that's happened. Like we're not even a layer in the layer cake. We're not even the icing dusted on the top of the sponge cake. We're like less than that in terms of the
yeah.
span of life on Earth. It's a blink of an eye. But as you say, 13 billion is since the Big Bang or whatever is an awfully long time for things to be going on out in the big world out there. Absolutely. So
Yeah.
that's why
So
it's educated guess work here about what might be going on.
yeah. So I guess what we're gonna I'll start with I'll talk about what is the term that people would talk about is something called panspermia.
Yeah.
So I just want to introduce the term panspermia. So you might know the term pan from like pansexual or so that just means pan is everything.
Or you're forgetting
So
pandemic, Jordan.
oh, pandemic. Yeah, everyone will know that one. So yeah, pandemic. So yeah, everything. And spermia, probably a bit more easy to figure out, is seed. So everything is seeded. Is the term panspermia.
And you're telling me
You know,
that this was come up with by a bloke called Anaxagoras.
uh, yeah. Well. This term, it's kind of one of those terms which, in modern scientific discussion, it's like a new hypothesis, but it's been around a long time. It's not something that like as much as scientists today, like, oh look, we've come up with a new hypothesis. There's probably someone who's thought of it before. There's been a lot of thoughts before us. So, but now first thing I want to talk about is looking back at who's had these thoughts before, and that Anaxagoras it's an interesting dude because he lived in he was a not now I'm gonna preface this with saying I'm not perhaps the knowledge of all Greek philosophy,
Yes.
but something called a pre-Socratic philosopher. So in the
Yes.
time before Socrates. So perhaps when you think of Greek philosophy, you think of that boom in thought, but this is before that. So a very ancient.
Yeah, that's right. And really, pre Socratic, if you look at the history of philosophy, pre Socratic is an extremely loose and unhelpful term in a lot of ways. It basically just means a time about which we know very little.
Yeah. So Anaxagoras, he was in the 5th century BC, and he came up with the idea that the universe was created with an infinite number of seeds, which which are the spermata, and that is where life on Earth came from. Yeah, and in terms of the seeds everywhere proposal,
Okay,
it was.
so does Anaxagoras suggest that there's seeds elsewhere? Does he talk about other planets?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's interesting because back then, the idea of what was in the cosmos was really unknown, and he was viewing the stars in the sky as rocks that could like just reflective planets or some kind of like thing that's where meteorites came from. Not
Okay.
he could never imagine there was little planets spinning around them or like they had their own solar systems, but he was like, there's all the places life could
Yeah,
be.
this is way
And
before Ptolemy said the Earth was round and that the sun, we went around it.
yeah, so he was viewing as space was filled with these little shiny dots, and that's where life could be on those little shiny dots.
Okay, not a bad
Um,
theory, Anaxagoras. You did pretty well with what you had.
yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that all his theories were good. He had some that were slightly creative, but he was someone who had this idea of that it was a challenge at the time for people to imagine because he talked about this thing called mind, which was like an intent. for like things to like propagate or like spread. And at the time, it was a bit controversial because he wasn't referring to like a god or a creator or whatever they had at the time back then in the 5th century BC. But he was like talking a lot about something that was like wanting to spread itself, wanting to have that formation. Um, and I perhaps view some of that as like, if you didn't know what Darwinism or evolution was, or the intent of something wanting to spread its own story, how would you explain evolution and the need to survival of the fittest or those kind of things 5,000 or 3,000 years before anyone had thought of them? So
Well, it's a very good question, and I actually have a thought to offer on it, which is that the Greeks, of course, had a lot of different ideas about the variety of organisms, and of course Aristotle had the most developed theories about life, which were obviously mostly needing updating. But the Hindus had a lot of thoughts about the number of species on the earth, and they even had a concept of like arranging them from like less developed to more developed. That's not the language they used, but it's kind of the implied idea. So it says somewhere in the scriptures, that the Hindu scriptures, that is, that there's 4,180,000 species on the planet or something like that, which is like not a bad guess for like five to 10,000 years ago. It's like pretty good, but there's more to it. They say that basically because they believed in reincarnation, they still do, that to get to be a human, you had to be reincarnated from like, they literally say the lowest worm in stool. Basically, they say it's essentially the idea that you have to get born as an amoeba and then another amoeba and then something else and then something else, and eventually you get reborn as a human. So it's like in AFL, you get 6 points for a goal and 1 point for a side. I'm going to give them 1 point. I'm not going to give them the 6 points, but I'm going to give them 1 point because there's something startlingly familiar about this idea. It's like the individual gets reborn as an increasingly more complex and more conscious organism over time, which is totally not how evolution works, but it is strangely echoing with sort of some of the ideas we have now, and that obviously they put humans at the top of the tree. But of course, the other reason it's worth talking about the Hindus is that they also talked about, life being all over the universe as well, all over many universes, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, and like connecting it with like the ancient Greeks' thoughts is that like they viewed that everything, if you looked at it close enough, would eventually go back to the simplest molecule, or not molecule, but like the simplest thing.
Well, atoms. So, they talked about atoms, of course, as one of the pre-Socratics, Democritus.
And the idea that everything, if you just followed it in enough depth, you would eventually all get back to the initial thing. And I guess the model equivalent with that would be like everything goes back to the space dust. But you could also go in that journey back to the space dust. You would get to the simplest form of whatever you are. That simplest form of life, or whatever you would want to call that. So, I can't hear you for a minute, Sam. What's that?
Sorry, this was another one of Anaxagoras' ideas.
Yeah, that everything went back to a simplest form. If and this was before they knew like what was a nutrient, what was that everything contained everything else in some form of another. So
well, he's kind of right on with that one, really, when you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, all these guesses. What are we doing for the last? He figured this out. Well, how many years ago?
But certainly, I mean, he could never have anticipated, the spiral helix and all of that. But certainly, the idea that every grain of life contains essentially everything is a very ancient intuition, which has a lot of truth to it, I think, and that it's something you also find in Hinduism, because where they state that every living entity has a soul, and that's a very familiar concept to Christians. But here's where it gets a little bit different. They say that every living thing has a tiny, tiny spark of God in them. So basically, God splits off a bit of its soul and like sticks it in every blade of grass and human and elephant and dog, like has a tiny bit of God in it. And that it's like a piece of God's consciousness is inside your body, which is kind of a startling idea. It's basically that every living being contains the universe, is sort of what it's saying. So
Yeah.
it's pretty wild stuff, but it does remind me a little bit of the idea that the DNA in every one of our cells containing just infinite possibilities.
Yeah. So what I did is I went and on that train I went and researched what was the earliest thought like that's recorded. So
Mm-hmm.
this is what you would call probably prehistory, and the
Yeah.
earliest evidences of that is in hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt. So this is 2000 BC, so 4,000 years ago. That's a long time. Which is I'm going to say it's the earliest, but it's also probably the weirdest, but also probably the most like like descript, which is the proto panspermia, which is the idea. It's connecting their thoughts of like gods and their thoughts of like this cosmos, which is now, so they connected a lot of these ideas of like the panspermia, the cosmic spreading, with also like humanistic ideas, which was like, and as weird and as strange as this is, the ejaculation of the gods into space, and there's hieroglyphs of essentially a godlike figure ejaculating into space
Yeah.
as the helper gods spread out their
Yeah.
the seed to and it's the reason that they perhaps the Egyptian the Egyptian ideas are really interesting is that there's so much connected with ancient Egypt and like stars and like and to have that thought that the cosmos was seeded by a god, while you were doing all these things, aligning pyramids with, stars and, actually describing that you understood the stars.
Well, I'll go
And,
further, Jordan. I mean, we all know the ancient Egyptians were Anunnaki. I mean, let's just take that for granted.
yeah, but it's the idea that, that they viewed the way that life was spread as a junk mail. Like the gods just went like, here you go, universe, I'm now spreading what. And I guess that's connecting with what we were talking about before, that we're not talking about like the gods went like, I'm going to seed the earth, I'm going to seed Mars, I'm going to seed whatever. It was just like, there you go, have our seed.
Oh, so when you say ejaculation, you don't even mean the purposeful kind that is like aimed somewhere. You just mean the spontaneous combustion without any particular intention, and out it all goes. It's sort of a little bit like the Big Bang, isn't it? It's sort of there's no intentionality and just stuff just goes flying everywhere. And look at the wonderful things that just happen accidentally as a result. And of course, it reminds me a little bit of quite a few of the science fiction stories that I came across that had panspermia in them. A lot of them were very like utopian, or glorifying humanity in some way, because that's what a lot of science fiction in the early days did, and some of it's starting to do that again. But it was sort of, let's say, it had a bit of a sort of conservative, or like the inevitable triumph of humanity type idea in a lot of science fiction. But like some of the ideas were like, we were put here by an advanced species who wanted us to be here, or we are the advanced species and we seeded the earth and then forgot about the fact that we used to ride around on starships in the past. But one of the stories sticks out to me now. It might have been Asimov, where the humans find their way to another planet to like recover their ancient heritage as starfarers who seeded life on Earth, or rather human life, and only to discover that they were the rats who escaped from the advanced spaceship, like of another master race, and like we were just the feral animals who like got out of the cargo hold, like a crown of thorns starfish. And so I really like the idea of things happening by accident, and any study of history will. If you look at history long enough, you start to realize how random a lot of it really is. And so I definitely like the idea of cosmic weeds and like premature ejaculation being how life got everywhere. So I love it.
Well, they call the universe something called the Nun, which is the cosmic sea, and the story is that he just ejaculated into the cosmic sea. It wasn't it wasn't, there was no aim. It was just into the sea, and the helpers will get it to where it needs to go.
Interesting.
So,
So which being is this? It's the cosmic all father type thing.
well, this is that in this part of Egypt's like hieroglyphics, it's not necessarily like there is just the god, which depending on which person or which sect you were, it was your god of Almighty.
Oh, insert your preferred all-father god here. So
Yeah,
the Romans or Greeks could come along and go, oh, they mean Jupiter or Zeus or whatever, I guess.
yeah. So
Yeah.
there is a specific one carved, but who that is not really known, because at the time that may have been whatever one that that carver or that that faith believed was that. But it looks just like that guy with the long headdress thing, and it's an underscript Almighty.
It does have a very definite Egyptian look about it, and there's no particular name given, but that's okay. So that's fascinating, and also for another reason, because in Hindu cosmology they have this guy, the Vastu Purusha, who's like the cosmic man, and he's a bit like Vitruvian Man, with the arms and the famous Renaissance drawing of human anatomy. But in Hindu cosmology they have this Vastu Purusha guy who's kind of like this giant space Buddha, who's like got a really fat belly, and like he's sort of in this almost like a meditation position, and then it shows stars all over his body. And I don't know if he's seeded life or anything, but he's like the cosmic man. I'm going to have to look up, remind myself. And yeah, go on.
So what I actually have, the next bunch of things I have is Hinduism. So
yeah,
great segue. But what I have here is actually connection to something called it's proto-Hinduism or something. So the ideas of Hinduism that were seeded all of the other, not that I'm an expert on Hinduism, but it's one of the more complicated religions that I could imagine.
Yeah, can I butt in? Yeah, Hindu cosmology is very complicated. Anyone who's studied the full range of, say, beliefs in ancient Egypt or ancient Greece will be pretty aware that it goes well beyond the stuff you've heard of. There's a ton more stuff you haven't heard of. But let's also keep in mind that ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, these places, that's a very big term for something that went on for thousands of years and that might have been quite different at one point and then quite different later. And the same goes for Hinduism. Because don't tell this to your friendly local Hindus, but they actually stole a lot of stuff from other religions, and they might have even stolen stuff from Greeks. And let's use a less judgmental word. They were influenced by other things. They'll tell you they were the first and they made up everything and they invented everything and all the science, they did it all themselves way before anyone else. And I'm prepared to give them a lot of credit. I will say this, their cosmology is probably the most complicated one out there. And even though they borrowed a ton of stuff from elsewhere, there seems to be a lot of original thoughts in there too. Anyway, so what did you find out?
Yeah, so in researching this, I came across it was phenomenal the amount of stuff that they talked about in terms of this. But the one that I'm going to focus on, someone called his name is Hirayana, which essentially means golden womb, which you can see where we're getting at here.
Hiranya,
yeah. So essentially, that he was the fetus that or the place, the womb that spread to all of the other places in their cosmic waters, which is their outer space, or in these texts that I looked at. So is this a well-known deity, I suppose? Oh, I can't hear you again.
Oh, sorry. I was muting myself to cut down on the amount of creaking shed and pigeon noise that was coming in. No, he's not a particularly well-known deity, and that may be because it comes from an earlier cosmology, and let's just say it's a bit like the Old Testament. No, not that many people are reading it that much, like there's more up-to-date stuff that's come out since then. Because, we have to bear in mind, this is a span of civilization of thousands of years. And so some stuff might get forgotten over time. And the other reason that maybe that's not talked about a great deal is that the Hinduism in the modern age tends to put more of an emphasis on like the deities that are in your present life that can help you right now. Like you pray to Lakshmi if you want to make money, you pray to this other god if you want to be healthy, you pray to this other god if you want your family to be happy, and that sort of thing. So a lot of modern Hinduism is sort of more focused on day-to-day worship and like making life good, and not necessarily a whole lot of time spent sitting around talking about where the universe came from.
Yeah, so this is dated to 1200 BC, so like 800 years after the Egyptian had this, but still, I mean, a lot of these texts are noted to be perhaps verbally passed down for hundreds of years, then only written down for us to discover them 1,200 years ago. So,
Yeah.
So these, really ancient thoughts, and the idea, and it's weird, the connection between the Egyptian and the Hinduism of the cosmic sea or the ancient waters or the like that is an ocean of life.
Oh, absolutely. No, I was about to say this earlier. I'm glad you reminded me. They talk, the English translation I'm most familiar with is the Causal Ocean, literally the ocean that causes all other things to happen, which is a bit like the idea of God as the original cause. Another translation from Sanskrit of God is the cause of all causes, basically. But then there's this other thing, which is the causal ocean, which obviously God created. And from that causal ocean comes all life. So yeah, this is a familiar concept to me.
Yeah, and that's the same as the Anaxagoras. So this is like ancient Greece. So this is 500 BC. So another 700 years after this Hindu beliefs is and the thing about Anaxagoras and all his thoughts is it's very much in a way that I could relate to the New Testament. It's like he didn't write it down; he told it to people. Then a few hundred years later, they were like, "We should write this down."
Oh yeah, we have to remember that most of these cultures, even though we do have writings that survive, it was mostly oral language that was transmitted, from one generation to the next. So, for example, the Hindu scriptures are in verse form. They're not written out like prose, like sentences and stuff. They're written as like rhyming verses, and the idea there is that you can remember thousands of them, believe it or not. And so you sit there reciting the verses, and then the apprentices sit there listening and trying to remember all of it. And so that's how a lot of this information was transmitted. And then one day, you can imagine how it would change maybe over time. And then one day, someone decides to write it down.
Yeah, and the part of this that really like locks it in is these people weren't just like talking of like theories and like whatever, like perhaps the mystical, is that this one is like the first one that I see that locks it down to like Anaxagoras believed that there was life on the moon. Like he wasn't just saying there was life in the universe, trust me. He was like pointing at the moon and saying, I bet there's life there. I bet some of the seeds fell onto the moon. Now we know he's probably not right. The moon is pretty inhospitable. But just the idea that he believed that some of the seeds didn't just land on Earth. He actually thought the seeds were going elsewhere and pointing at a place and going there. Realistically at the time, they didn't even know other planets existed. But he was pointing at whatever was in the space, whatever in space, and going, yeah, life's there too.
Oh, well, and when you think about it, if you're an ancient natural philosopher like one of these Hindus or Egyptians or Anaxagoras, picturing him looking at the night sky with no telescope, and a certain amount of mathematics and like sort of pretty simple stuff compared to what we have now. But why would they look at the moon and think it didn't have life on it? Honestly. Like,
yeah.
I've thought about this a lot. Like when I was a kid looking at the moon, and yeah, absolutely, I had no problem imagining someone living there. Or of course, most children can imagine, the man in the moon, like it's sort of a story that we have in Western culture, and you can see the man in the moon and all that. So I think really the burden of proof in ancient times was on people saying that there wasn't life.
Yeah. Some of not that I'm going to bring it up now, but some of the things I was looking, but people like ants that lived on the moon and like all those things, like the craters were giant ant holes and all those things. Just it was a pretty widespread belief, the idea that life was on the moon for a long time. So
and let's not forget like War of the Worlds. One of the original sort of modern science fiction novels. They're like, hey, there's a whole civilization on Mars, and they're coming to get us. Like, if you go and read sci-fi now, it's beyond Mars. Like, you don't start a sci-fi novel now with "there's life on Mars" because we just know too much about Mars. You know what I mean? Like, it's harder to believe. But so now if we talk about alien races coming in sci-fi, they're usually coming from a very, very, very long way away. Pleiades or Antares or Sirius or some nearby star perhaps, which is still very, very far away. But to ancient people, the moon was, in a sense, as impossibly distant as Pleiades is to us now. And I think that it would have seemed strange if you'd gone around saying to people that there wasn't life on these other planets. I think if you look throughout human history, there's a very, very persistent belief in the persistence of life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'll definitely agree with like the idea that we live in a time where just going to the moon is within like I could say confidently. I think if someone wanted to get there in the next year with all the money in the world, they could like they'd be there. You know, imagine that's such an incredible like for all of human history, it was an unfathomably far away and distant, unreachable place. So
You're absolutely right. It's certainly not a trivial thing to go to the moon even today, but it's certainly entirely achievable. And to compare that with the absolutely unconquerable distances, both physically and metaphorically, the, the limited tools that humanity had, they had the same brains as us, thousands of years ago, but just none of the same conceptual tools built up, or the actual physical tools like telescopes. And so I think the fact that they looked around everywhere and saw life everywhere. Also, picture a world where, you know, two-thirds of species had not gone extinct compared to today. And so there was just a lot more wild animals around. So the ancient scriptures are full of like terrifying beasts. Like it's a world that's very, very rich in life. Like even just on this planet, they talk about, like the Hindu scriptures talk about enormous whales, like the size of small cities or something in the ocean. Like they talk about giant birds that come and like carry humans away. They talk about just epic animals that are very hard to imagine in like the sort of ecologically, well, I won't say devastated, but like ecologically depleted world that we live in now. Like all the megafauna are long gone. Like just imagine a world where huge animals were walking around all the time.
yeah, yeah, it's almost alien in itself to us. And I mean, connecting to that is the next one I want to look at is Christianity and Judaism, which is one of the more interesting ones because the in researching this, I learned a lot about Gnosticism. I didn't really know about that, perhaps because I just learned in my of the the texts that remain, the widespread ones. The idea that there was the hundreds of books that were created, and some of them are based around the idea of this, divine spark or golden seed, or the the Judeo-Christian beliefs also include this, but perhaps not the ones that are the ones that were brought to prominence in the the structure that is the church. So
Well, certainly, Jordan. If you ask me today, what would modern Christians think about life on other planets? So, or let's say no. Let's make it more interesting. What would medieval Christians think about life on other planets? And I think you'll find that they were pretty against the idea,
yeah,
because it might be there in the Old Testament, or you're about to tell me what the Gnostics thought. But medieval and modern Christianity is not really that keen on the idea of aliens because it sort of diminishes the specialness of humanity, and there seems to be a dominant interpretation of Christianity which suggests that humans are kind of the be-all and end-all and like the greatest thing ever. Correct me if I'm wrong. But are you saying that ancient Christians might have been a little bit, dare I say it, more open-minded maybe?
Well. There's quite a few examples, but probably the most prominent one I'm gonna is a prophet called Mani. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, and there was a faith called Manichism or Manichism, which was
Manichaeism, which is the
Manichaeism.
belief in good and evil. Because believe it or not, good and evil is not that ancient a concept. Like it goes back a fair way, but as far as some scholars are concerned, in terms of the written sources that we have, good and evil doesn't, as an established kind of doctrine, doesn't really go back that far. Probably not more than about 10,000 years, according to some people.
Yeah. So this faith, because they're in the creation, a lot of like people of the Jewish faith were in Egypt in the time that all of these panspermia beliefs were around. That some of the thoughts and ideas from that time were translated down into this new Christian faith.
Yeah, Jordan, can I interrupt
And just
one more time? Whenever we talk about religious sources, because I think they're some of the most interesting things around, let's keep in mind that religious sources are layer upon layer upon layer of stuff that they got from somewhere else a lot of the time. And so there's not really, we tend to think of the world's religious traditions as being quite distinct and having their own sort of paths. And yes, there are differences, but basically a lot of it, an incredible amount of it overlaps.
Yeah, and this path of that borrowing from other cultures directly goes back to that panspermia idea of like that God had seeded the universe and we, the good seeds and the bad seeds and those kind of ideas.
Okay.
And
So Mani talked about good seeds and bad seeds.
well, I'm no expert in in this whole faith, to be clear, but just the idea that there was like the light, and the light was the seed, and from what I can gather, the dark was something else.
Interesting. Well, I
But
guess presumably. Well, I mean, every religion has. If you're going to talk about good and evil, well, then you have to explain where each one comes from. Yeah.
yeah, so like the light seed formed, life, and that, and it's connects to a lot of the things but to be clear, this faith within Christianity was absolutely forbid once it got some prominence. It was wiped from the thing. The only reason we even know about this is some ancient, translations were found in the 1940s or something that were hidden, deep dark libraries that were like hidden from the people destroying everything.
Yes,
This
because
is like,
let's not forget the Great Fire. You may have heard of the fire at the Library of Alexandria. Well, that was set by Christians, um, and they wanted to get rid of a lot of pagan knowledge. Well, that's one of the theories, anyway.
yeah, so this was one of those things that was definitely aimed to be wiped out of the history books of that faith, and I guess it almost like endears some of those original ideas that because one of the stories that is highlighted in connecting those two things is I know we all probably all know the idea of the seeds that the parable, what's it called, it's
The
the
Sermon on the Mount.
the sermon. They're talking about the sorry, I'm no expert in this, but the parables concerning the sowing of the seeds.
Yes, and this is a widely debated parable. So yeah, interesting. What sort of meanings do you take from it?
Well, the idea that when he's talking about the seeds, he's not just talking about like as such a small scope as what it's often like thought to be, the seeds of the faith, or seeds of like Christianity, but perhaps the seeds of everything. Thinking of it because there's an interesting idea that he follows up with, like he says something that's really weird. Like one of his followers questions it, and he says like, you would only understand if you knew about, like if you had the thought, you would only understand it if you were thoughtful enough to fully understand it.
Yeah,
And
the Sermon on the Mount is fantastic because it is so open to interpretation. Some of it in it is some of the stuff in it is really, really clear. He's definitely making it explicit. Some of it, like this is what you're supposed to do and not do as a Christian. This is what God wants and this is what God doesn't want. Some of it's very obvious, but a lot of it seems to be deeply layered metaphors. And we're not just talking just nice poetical imagery here. Some people go further and say that basically Jesus was encoding secret messages into the sermon.
yeah, like I'll read here, and just view this in the idea of that if you were thinking of the universe being seeded, how you could easily take this and copy and paste it there. So
Yeah, so imagine
um,
imagine a sort of pre-Christian world, because I know, wrap your head around this for a second. Christianity didn't exist in the time of Jesus, right? So let's just remember that these are all Jews, right? And other related faiths that we've sort of forgotten existed, and so they weren't talking about a world where there's sort of a Christian orthodoxy, which is that no, there's only humans that are conscious, and we're God's chosen people, and that's that. So this is not quite that world.
yeah, so the story is that the seeds fell on some land and it was good and they took root, and the seeds fell on some land, took root, and then the seeds landed on other lands where it was thorny and they didn't take root.
Yeah, so this is obviously taken most of the time as to talking about how you can talk good Christian gospel, and some people will be receptive and some people won't be.
Yeah. So it's the meaning put on it, like from the books of today, are that this is talking about the person's soul or the person's spirit, but in these other translations, it often has a more like literal sense of the seeds that have landed in places that some grow and some don't, and perhaps that he's speaking in the kingdom of heaven. Maybe Earth is just one of those places in the kingdom of heaven where the seed
Yeah,
took.
that's right. And obviously, it's a longer walk to get to that, but I don't think we should cut it out offhand, because it's certainly within the context of the sermon to interpret the message about the seeds as being about faith and how faith can take seed in someone's heart through a message, that certainly interpretation certainly makes a great deal of sense and is like an easy one to reach for. But you have to also keep in mind that in these societies, their metaphors were heavily about there's agricultural metaphors all through these civilizations, right? So agricultural metaphors had very, very wide and it had a lot of richness, right? So let's just not stop at this faith idea. Let's go a bit further.
Yeah, so I've luckily I've printed off the actual. So from Mark, the New Testament of Mark, it goes. So some seeds fell on the path, and birds came and devoured it. So there was already life there. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately sprang up, and it had no depth to the soil. So planets where it wasn't the right place. And then when the sun rose, it scorched it, since it had no roots. So planets that were not of habitable, and withered away. And other seeds fell among thorns, and then the thorns grew and choked it up. So life's already been there. And then other seeds fell in good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. You could, not that at any way that I think that Mark in the New Testament is relating to that, but just if you were someone who believed in this panspermia theory, an early Christian, you could take that parable and go, Jesus is directly talking about that aspect of my faith.
Yeah, correct. So picture yourself in ancient, the Holy Land in ancient times or near ancient times, and picture it as a very religiously diverse world. So it wasn't just, just Jews hanging around that part of the world. There were other faiths there, and you had these different cults and sects. You had your Manichaeans and you had your thises and your thats, and also you had Egypt was next door. That was right there. And the Babylonians were next door, and they had their beliefs. And, then there were other cultures to the north, and, of course, India over to the east. And probably a lot of reason to believe that because Alexander conquered all the way to, India 700 years before Jesus. So there's plenty of reason to believe that we had a lot of stuff coming out of India. And we know from Hindu scriptures that they were being influenced by the Greeks. And so there's no reason to believe that the influence wasn't coming in the other direction. And why am I talking about the Greeks so much? Well, because the Gospels were written in Greek. So the New Testament is basically, the best-selling book in the Greek language, and in all languages, and it is full of Greek ideas. So the stuff in there, we think of it as a Jewish cultural milieu, and it is, but a lot of those Jews spoke Greek, and they were part of a kind of semi-Roman, semi-Greek world. And don't forget, at these times, the Romans and the Greeks were both technically pagans, and all of the people around them were technically pagans. There were a few people over there in Iran, who had monotheism. They believed in just one god, what were they called, the Zoroastrians. And then you had some other monotheistic religions, but most of these were pantheistic religions. There's that word pan again. So there's this belief in this tremendous proliferation of gods. And so it's not hard to think about a proliferation of life in general.
Yeah, so the next stepping stone on our journey to today is actually jumping forward quite a few hundred years to closer to our time. But who are the more recent minds who have thought of this idea? But and you'll find that when we jump to like the 1800s, it becomes a lot more like what we're about to dive into, is that idea of actually the cosmos, and now they understand planets. Now they understand other star systems, or maybe not star systems, but other stars are like our star. Maybe not so widely accepted in some areas of the world, but they understood they were stars. That's a star. So I've got this is Dr. Malliot speaking on relating to some of these things where they in these times they actually had the ideas that seeds landed on some globes being Earths or Earth-like things, and other globes not. And there's like Lord Kelvin, perhaps pretty famous for the Kelvin unit. So someone who's very influential in science. Directly talked about massy stones transporting things from one planet to another. That's meteorites, I guess, in our thing. Well, I'm going to talk about that later. But the idea of actually coming up with a device that could transport life.
Massy stones, as in stones having mass?
Well, yeah, large stones.
Yeah, sure. Like rocky planets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
somehow stones are transport, so meteorites, like that's when they actually came up with like it's not just something the gods start spreading a seed. Back in this time in his life, they were actually coming up with the idea of how could a life get from here to there without magic.
Oh, okay. So there was an attempt here at creating some sort of rational framework.
Yeah, and that's what they call them, the massy stones that have, and they were thinking in terms of maybe plant seeds, or like, this is before bacteria, but a plant seed on a meteorite going to another planet.
And here's a quick question, Jordan. At this point, are we talking pre-Darwinian theory or post that?
Yeah, pre.
So, but nonetheless, don't think of the world as strictly, there was a time when we had the theory of evolution and there was a time when we had nothing like it, because it's not quite like that. There were actually a lot of guys before Darwin who were kind of thinking along the same lines. And so some of the ideas that became Darwinism were sort of there already. So, but nonetheless, this was a time when we didn't even have an idea about geology, of like how the continents could move. And so this was a time when they used to think about land bridges between continents to explain how this plant got from here to there. So imagine the difficulty they would have had trying to explain how life got from one planet to another.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've got here, so Isaac Taylor, which is the physical theory of another life in 1836. So this is probably, that thought of Darwin not being, a sole thinker. But, talking about, he just straight up said, like, because we've got his text now, we've got direct quotes from him. None could tolerate the idea, and especially seeing what we see in our own planet, that the innumerable spheres around us are totally untenanted, and that the stupendous celestial mechanism is a mechanism merely.
Okay, can I translate into plain English, Jordan? What he's saying is they couldn't get their head around the idea that these other planets didn't have life on them. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that the burden of proof in ancient times, but let's admit it, maybe even more recently, maybe even right now, in a sense, the burden of proof is on the people that say there's no life out there.
Yeah, and the modern ideas of all this panspermia that is cropping up now, with the ideas of finding signs of life on Venus and water on Mars,
or slime and sulfur loving species living in just almost unimaginable conditions that like we're finding all the time.
Yeah. It's a thought that's been around for hundreds of years, with like a direct mechanism and the scope of what they're talking about has been around for a while, which is something I find, like, I never had learned this in years of learning about science, that people had thought life is elsewhere, and they're pretty confident in some of the theories.
Well, I'm glad you say this, Jordan, because let's just, cards on the table, everybody, in case you haven't picked it up. Jordan and I are firmly in the camp of science with a small s, in the sense that that's what we're going to go with in terms of what we think is likely. But we're open to like looking at what other people thought about in the past. And I'm quite happy to say that science and thinkers today, and thinkers all through history, that for that matter, have a tendency to be a little bit arrogant and forget about all the things that people thought about before this moment. And we tend to have a very insulting view of people in the past. We tend to think that they were a bit stupid, or that they were racist, or that they were this or that. And we're awfully clever and wise and fair-minded compared to those, idiots back in the 50s, or those idiots back in ancient times, or whatever. But the reality is, like I've said all through this show, that people have always believed in the existence of life elsewhere.
Yeah, and on that, like, people like coming up with an idea as a novel idea when it's probably to imagine Mayans had a calendar based on the stars thousands of years before we'd even thought to look at them. People have had an idea about the cosmos and its more deeper meaning than and one of the things that I in looking at this is revisiting the idea of the deep field telescope, the deep field images of what happens if you point the most powerful telescope at an area that looks like it has nothing in space. Imagine if you could show that picture to someone back then, they would just have their mind blown.
Yes, and I think it's absolutely fair to say that I take it you're referring to that classic image, which is where they show you this massive star field, and then they go, let's look at this tiny little black pixel, right? So they take
which has nothing in it. It's empty.
It's empty, right? Because there's literally no data coming from it. with any of the traditional equipment, right? And we're talking like pretty good equipment here, but it's not picking up anything in that spot. And then they go, I know, let's just look at that 1 pixel for a bit and see what we can find. And then it turns out there's a ton of stuff there in that dark spot. And so
the pointing the most powerful telescope at an area of nothing and then going, what's there? And there's just like countless galaxies in that 1 pixel of nothing.
And Jordan, and it's probably one of the most, I'd say it's probably the most famous picture in astronomy now, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I mean, other than the picture of the Earth from space, but it's probably the second most.
Yeah, other than the blue marble picture or like Earthrise over moon, those are probably two of the most famous images. But apart from that, I think that in terms of recent images, I think this is probably one of the biggest. And it's not hard to see why, because it is truly mind-blowing. And as you say, it is an incredible thought. What if we could take that image back in time with us? Maybe let's put it in a painting or something, so that we're getting around the whole problem of the sort of the technology transfer. And let's just take this painting of this section of the sky back and then point to that section of the sky and say, here's what's there behind all that stuff you can see with the naked eye. Would those ancient people be mind blown? Well, yes, but also let's picture you doing this in India in particular. Okay, so because I didn't say enough about Hindu cosmology earlier. So in that causal ocean we were talking about before, it says that it's an ocean of milk, by the way, which is interesting because milk's, quite nutrient rich. And this is a pretty wacky cosmology. So there's a bed of snakes lying on that ocean of milk. Stay with me here, people. This is going to take a little while. There's a bed of snakes, right? Have you got that? This snake has hundreds of heads. Have you got that? All of these heads are chanting the scriptures simultaneously, different scriptures, right? Okay, got all that. There's a 4-armed Vishnu, which is like a god, like lying on the bed of snakes. The bed of snakes is his brother, but also kind of himself. Okay, you with me so far? Now, picture that ocean of milk living inside some sort of bubble or something. And then that's in space, floating there, right? And then out of Vishnu's belly button, there's a special name for this Vishnu, which is Garbhodakshayi Vishnu. Anyway, so out of this guy's belly button comes like a stem, right? And then a flower comes out of that stem. And then in that flower is Brahma, the god of creation, and then he has 4 heads. And then Brahma gives rise to like the first human, Manu, I think they call him. And then Manu goes and progenites the rest of humanity, a bit like the Old Testament, right? Now, let's zoom out for a second. Picture that bubble in space. Now let's just zoom out a tiny bit more. Uh-oh, here's another little bubble. Here's another little one. Oh, guess what? Inside each bubble is another ocean of milk with another bed of snakes, with another Vishnu in it, with another flower growing out of his tummy, with Brahma in it. Now, zoom out further. There's thousands of these things. Oh, my God, they're everywhere. Okay. Oh, and in them, the Brahmas have different amounts of heads. So, which some say is like all these worlds have different numbers of dimensions or something or other. There's all different interpretations. Now, zoom out further. Where are all these bubbles coming from? Oh, they're coming from a giant Vishnu who's floating in space. And he's asleep. And he's breathing out and breathing in, right, as you do when you're asleep. And every time he breathes out, thousands of universes go out in these little bubbles. And then, here's the best part. He breathes back in and the universes go back in. So that is the level of that's the scale of the universe that these guys had in mind. So in the Hindu scriptures, there's like descriptions of the spans of time that like this thing was around for and this thing was around for. And then you can find a reference somewhere else that says this span of time is this many of our current Earth years. And then you go, okay, so now we can do some calculations. And then you come up with figures like the Hindus were basically saying that the Earth was like very, very, very old. Not your 6,000 years from the Bible. They were saying hundreds of thousands, millions of years old, right? So they were much closer to like the real figures. And then they talk about spans of space and time that are absolutely vast. Like they've got figures in there that are like equating to our billions and our trillions. And so they talk about the universes as being many, and they talk about the universes as being very old, and they talk about the universes as being created and destroyed again and again and again. So I ask you, maybe if you took that painting to India, maybe they'd be like, If you took it to the right person, they'd be like, "Oh yes, this confirms what we already knew."
Yeah. Actually, would I feel like some of these ancient, like if you took it to the guy who carved that hieroglyph, he would think the same thing. Oh yeah, exactly. This is what I meant. I just didn't know how to carve that.
And besides, it's fun to draw giant space dicks.
Yeah, literally the. I don't know if I should include the picture in this thing, but that's what it is.
Look, I think, Jordan, if you don't include the picture, it'd be terribly unfair. So everybody, get in your time machine and go to the future where this has all been done and see if there's a dick on the screen.
All right. So what I want to do now is transition to what we perhaps know now, and how it almost fits into those gaps that were left by, and this is obviously thinking of the idea of, if you in evolution, if you have one missing link and you find it, then you've got two missing links, because you've got the one before and after it. So obviously not, this is not the be all and end all. This is a fully open. This is my assumption of filling in the gaps, not at all scientific tested anyway. So and I'm gonna follow the path of accidental panspermia. So the idea that you spoke on before, of the idea of us being like celestial rats, or like we like the idea of that someone has accidentally dropped us off.
We're cosmic feral species. We're cosmic introduced species.
Yeah, that is a whole other line of thought that I'm gonna leave, because that's so much more complicated and requires so much more, like, if this but that. This one, I'm going to go to the simplest.
Well, hang on, hold on. Basic. Just quick sidebar. So we're not going to talk about the cosmic weeds and the cosmic ferals, but you're going to go down the line of an accidental panspermia. Okay.
Yeah. So, but I'm happy later. Let's go. But just for now, that's the river I'm going to travel down. The river splits, and I'm going to go that river.
All right, sure.
So I want to just. For Earth, what is the seed? So the first thing I wonder, what is the seed? Well, what is the simplest version of life? So, like, what is the prime? So let's go primordial life. You've got 1 million planets ready for primordial life. What is the simplest primordial life? And one of the, I guess, the interesting things is I've gone through some of the news and the research on what's the simplest version of a self-replicating molecule, and often
in existence today, you mean?
Well, in existence on Earth ever. Probably doesn't exist today, other than those extremophiles that live in hot springs and, edges of volcanic areas and things like that. But one of the things they found is that the evidence for primordial life they have on Earth says that Earth back then was such a good place for primordial life. And one of the interesting things I see, that when we search for life today, we're searching for like this somewhere else, like a 21% oxygen with blue
100%. We have a very chauvinistic and sort of limited view of what life is, for starters, because we can't help it. But secondly, like the Goldilocks zone is what we talk about when we're looking for the perfect planet. And it's a worthy name for the idea, because it's like Goldilocks is going around looking for like the right bowl of porridge and the right bed to sleep in, and that's essentially what humanity's doing. We're looking for another crib somewhere else in space. Like, let's be clear here, and we're looking for things that we can eat. Yes. And if you look at a lot of the genome research that's going on, it's people trying to patent things that you can eat. Right? That, like, let's be clear that's mostly what we're interested in here. Most of the science being done in the world today is commercial science. It's interested in things that you can profit from. So we're looking for planets that we can profit from. And so we are maybe not thinking about this in quite the right way, and that this sort of Goldilocks fairy tale of what we can find out there is maybe not the right way to think about it.
Yeah. So the idea that, like, what is a habitable zone? What is a planet? We're looking for habitable for humans, habitable for like for animals that we know, whereas life doesn't necessarily need that. And early, if you could go back 4 billion years and go in a spacecraft and look back at Earth, you'd go not habitable.
4 billion years ago, it was quite a different place, wasn't it? Do you want to just briefly describe it?
Well, 4 billion years ago, I want you to. There's no oxygen. The oceans are filled with caustic. Basically poisonous oceans. There'd be volcanoes going off all the time. The hot springs would be like geysers would be everywhere, because the volcanic activity is just way higher. The Earth's so much hotter. that the idea of that things are float, like the solar system isn't like as much as the solar system is kind of a dangerous place now, it's pretty much the meteors are in the same place. There's a band of asteroids, and most of them are there. This is a time where things are whizzing in and out of solar systems constantly, smashing into planets like there's no tomorrow.
So you're saying the Earth's environment locally was quite hostile to what we would imagine as good, worthwhile life. But not only that, the immediate environment was quite hostile as well.
Yeah, and there's literally the moon just collided with the Earth 4 billion years ago. There's other planets that aren't even like settled yet, whizzing into things. The idea of Pluto not being in a regular orbit, because it's eventually, if you took enough time, eventually that's going to whiz into something if it crosses its path enough times. That's the universe, that's the solar system back then. Is things whizzing around, smashing into each other.
It's a pretty gnarly place, and the Earth is pretty gnarly also. Okay.
Yeah. If you went back that long and looked at the Earth, you wouldn't go, man, that's where I'm going to settle. And that's the same planet that we're on today, 4 billion years ago, not habitable. But what would you look for if you were looking for the earliest signs of? If you could go back 4 billion years, what would you look for? So, the evidence that they found is RNA is the most simple molecule. Which is basically a bunch of amino acids which are formed together. And they have heaps of evidence of amino acids being able to form abiotically, so just forming in nature because it's a nice, convenient thing. So if you have a bunch of types of molecules, phosphorus, carbons, and all that floating around, there's a few nice patterns they like to fall into because they're low energy states.
So I just got to butt in one more time in case we've got any proper sciencey people listening. When you say the simplest molecule, you mean the simplest molecule that could
make itself again?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. There's two main theories that go on that is the ones that the geothermal vents, where, in the bottom of oceans where, minerals and atoms and molecules are spewing out of like lava, hot heated water.
So in other words, don't think about a primordial soup. Think about a primordial volcano.
Yeah, but perhaps that's the one that I want to veer away from, because that's the idea that somehow life made its way to the bottom of an ocean and then formed there. I think a much more promising origin story for life on this planet is if we go with the theory that is those volcano geysers and hot springs, where it's on the surface and it's got the component and it's connected directly with somewhere where something from another planet could land on it. It doesn't have to land in a specific spot and fall to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. So picture, when Jesus was talking about casting the seeds, right? So this goes back to a very ancient form of agriculture where you literally just got a handful of seeds and you just scattered them on the ground, and then maybe you shoveled you scooped a bit of soil over the top just to keep them in place and maybe gave it a bit of a watering, but you weren't very, very deliberately and carefully planting seeds in neat little rows. You were just kind of throwing them out there. And so these seeds we're not drilling down to the bottom of oceans here. They just need to settle on the surface and find something to live in.
Yeah. So experiments in early Earth conditions, and on asteroids, which is not developed by life things. There's been evidence of sugars, bases, phosphates that they can naturally arise.
Wait a second. Quick question: is there any water 4 billion years ago?
Yes, there's water.
Okay, cool.
But the water is not the ocean water is not what we think of now, and that's why I think perhaps those geysers are a better play, because one of the things about geysers that makes it a really promising place for life to start is it has a cyclic effect. The geyser goes off, then it dries out. The cyclic goes off, it dries out.
Yes,
it has that
regularity is the key to life. That's one theory.
So that's the idea. Imagine you're in a science lab and you're doing an experiment. You're going to do cycles of DNA replication or RNA replication.
Or let's go back to the present. Humanity has benefited enormously from the cycles of the tides, the cycles of the moon, obviously related to the tides, the cycles of the sun rising and setting, the cycles of the Earth tilting, and what's the other thing the planet does where it has the orbital perturbation. So in theory, we've benefited from all of these things.
Yeah, so that's the theory that I'm on this journey down the river. I'm going to go into that canal, that these places on the surface of the Earth are having cyclic effects, giving the the components that could form a basic life molecule.
Yeah. So picture a geyser, right? And it's doing its thing. It's going off every so often. So maybe an analogy for that is like those tidal zones of life, where like the water comes in, the water goes out, and all sorts of things kind of live in that space where the water goes in and out.
Yeah, and thinking of this, the Goldilocks that you're speaking of, there's also, for life, there needs to be a membrane around it. It needs to be something holding it together so it can make another thing. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of things replicating. And in these, these early, life places, and in modern day, hot springs and things, they've been able to replicate things without initial cause, like the components that make up membrane. So the things that hold the cell together can form those bubbles. A bubble is a very nice way for things to arrange themselves, and they've been able to replicate bubbles of membranes forming. And just by chance,
are we talking artificially created environments in laboratories?
Well, some of the things that I read was about they took these things that they were doing in laboratories and took them to geysers and just sat them in the geyser. And from there, they were able to get it.
They literally just took some ingredients and went to make a cake in the geyser. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not, there's no like, oh, if only this was, like this. It's like, here you go. It's making it. Have a look. So I think that makes it a really promising way to start this journey, is that there's something natural that could occur.
So they were able to get these things to make sugars, did you say?
Well, yeah, sugars, phosphates, and the bases, which are the three things that make up RNA. In a more complex way, you could say they make up DNA, but obviously DNA takes all.
So what are the three ingredients of RNA? Sugar, phosphate, and
the amino acid bases. So they're like, when you have your amino acids, you've got your, humans have their amino acids they need to eat, and your body is made up of amino acids and things that it can self-make. But essentially, these are the very basic building blocks of what, say, a protein is, or like what an RNA is. So the things that make up everything.
Yeah. So you mean to tell me, Jordan, amino acids are not just things that Joe Rogan sells you?
No. Yeah. But yeah, so basically the things that you need to make up something complicated enough to replicate itself. So all the things that can make up that, they can make that in nature or naturally without interference, and also a membrane to go around those things. Because obviously membrane is important to, having something that can make more and be ordered.
Okay, so when you say membrane, I'm picturing something like quite sophisticated, but you're saying it could just be something quite simple?
Well, essentially just like the basic, fats that go like form a bubble. It's basically a bubble that encases something. It's microscopic. It'd be tiny, but it's just enough that you could accidentally, find one of those self-replicating molecules inside the bubble. And the idea of that one of the theories of the most successful way that could exist is basically something that all its code needs to says is make another one of me and do something else. It doesn't even need to say and make this and make a structure and make a self-replicating whatever. It just needs to say make one of me and do one other thing.
Correct. And so when a lot of people think about evolution, they've got a lot of very complicated ideas in their mind. Often it's a lot simpler at the basic level than you might imagine. And all that's really needed, in theory, for evolution and mutation and natural selection to occur, all you need is one thing that replicates. That's it.
Yeah, and the to go from like what is the most basic amount of things that can tell itself to make itself again is not that complicated. It's only like it's a tiny molecule that says replicate me.
It's complex compared to one atom of hydrogen, but it's a lot simpler than perhaps what you might imagine.
Yes, it's much easier than going, oh, how did a chimpanzee make another chimpanzee from nothing? No, it's just a bunch of molecules that have found their way accidentally to each other that say, make another one of me right next to me, plus do one other thing. And then you've got the start of evolution. But what I want to propose in this journey that we're taking is that the start of this river isn't on Earth. So we've got millions of planets out there that could be in the same primordial state, and the start of this river isn't Earth. The start of this river is another planet, ages away, distant time and space, infinitely from our imagination. And we have, all it's done is it's made a molecule that says, make me plus another thing. And that's as far as it's got. And the whole planet is covered in these gases, and the whole planet is this. And then, like the early solar system, very sad story. Things are whizzing around, and boom, hits the side of you. So the things that I'm gonna go down the road of planetary ejection, which is the idea of an asteroid smashing into you and throwing things into space, or a moon smashing into you, and like another planet smashing into you and ejecting millions of meters of stuff into space.
And just in case you think this sounds far-fetched, it is a far more common occurrence in the cosmos than we originally thought. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna go down the river one step at a time. So we've got planetary ejection, which is, what does it take to go into space, and what does it take to get back into a planet? So we've got shock pressures. There's a limit on shock pressure, and there's a limit on how fast something can go into a planet before it combusts. They've got that at, here's just some numbers, that 3 meters per second, or 3 megameters per second, apologies, and 6 gigameters per second cubed. So they're like shock pressures that basically go from one Kelvin to 1,000 Kelvin.
Well, and I was going to say that's a pretty big range.
Yeah, but basically from that, it's not that hard. I'm going to look at that in a sec. But within the range, those are acceptable numbers that could get life in or out of a planet, or those molecules in or out of a planet. It's within an acceptable range. It's not. It doesn't need to be floating down on a feather. It can pretty much barrel into a planet and probably be fine.
So we're not talking about the reintroduction of Apollo 13 into the Earth's atmosphere here. It's slightly more robust, the parameters.
Yeah. A rock that's cubic meters big that just has a few of these molecules in it barreling into the planet.
At 3 megameters per second, is that what it was?
Well, I'll get to. I have another paper that tells me that more specific what the number. I'm just
3 megameters. I'm trying to translate that into kilometers per hour, and I just can't do it. Do you happen to have the figure?
This. Well, it goes shock pressure is probably better, but so this is gigapascals, 5 to 55 gigapascals. That's a more maybe a more understandable.
How many pascals do I have in my bike tube?
Oh, I don't know.
I think it's like 70 kPa. It's like 70,000 70,000 pascals in my bike tube. And so how many are we talking shock pressure for entering?
The minimum of that's like a few thousand of that. But I mean, your bike tube is nothing.
Yeah.
If you said go fall from space in a bike tube, I'd be like, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So there is another one that I just want to just put out there. I don't necessarily want to use this as the but there is another idea of things that if you're in a geyser, you're getting shot up into space. Just naturally things just go out of geysers. And one of the ways that we've been able to investigate the properties of other moons in the solar system is to fly satellites by them and like capture the mist of the geysers. So
sick. I was going to say, like, I'm picturing a geyser shooting some life or self-replicating molecules into the air, but then of course my immediate objection to that is, but wait a minute, what about gravity? Aren't they just going to come down again? But wait a minute. Here comes a friendly passing meteor, and it's skimming through the atmosphere, right near the surface of this planet without getting sucked into orbit. Is that what we're picturing?
Yeah. So a meteor just flies by a planet or moon. It could even be a moon that has some early primordial soup that shoots into the sky, and it just gets collected on the way out.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Nice.
Yeah, that's not the river we're going to go down, but I just want to say that's a very adjacent river, if that makes sense. So, but what I want to is that once they're in space, so let's see, the different ways they could get in space is that one of the ones that I think is the most we can picture it is the asteroid that smashed into the Earth when dinosaurs were around. Most of us have a pretty good grasp of what that was like for Earth. So
and also it's the opposite of starting life. We think of it as ending life.
Yeah. So there's a theory that's going around that if we find life on Mars, well, perhaps we just found life that transported from, say, the time of the dinosaurs in a expulsion event from the Earth, where the meteor hit the Earth and shot all of the debris into space. And this basically says that it's basically guaranteed with the amount of material that went into space that we will, because we found Mars asteroids on Earth all the time. It's one of, there is a lot of evidence of Mars. Like, I mean, it's not a lot, but it's a numerous amount of Mars asteroids.
Well, actually, Jordan, let me just stop you. It is a lot, because when you think about the amount of rocks we could be picking up and analyzing, it's a vast number, right? And so to think about the amount of geology we've done compared to the amount of planet there is, and then to have already, out of the very small sample compared to how big the planet is and how many rocks it's got in it, we've managed to find ones from Mars. So it actually is a high rate.
Yeah, and I mean, most of it goes into the ocean, which is probably better in a sense.
Yeah.
This is going. There is some trains of thought that going into the ocean is actually worse for early life, whereas landing in these geysers and these freshwater pools is better.
Well, because we're picturing the Earth's oceans as such as pretty inhospitable by today's standards.
Yes, very caustic.
But what have we got so far? We've got things that might have landed on Mars and things that might have come from Mars to us. Okay, we've got rocks flying around everywhere.
Yeah. So just to talk of that in this solar system, if we find life on another planet, the chances that we can say that life started on that planet is actually really low because of the amount of material that Earth has shot out, and we know life is here.
I'm so glad you say that. So one of the key features of evolution and the construction of biological life through replicating molecules, from my understanding as a non-biologist, is that evolution is very conservative, is how Richard Dawkins put it in one of his books. So the idea is that nature doesn't want to do things a million times over if it can just do it once. And so you don't want to you don't want to have to explain it coming about twice when you can do with once.
Yeah, and so on this is they estimate that 360,000 large rocks went to Mars from historical Earth impacts, which is a damn lot.
That is a lot.
Yeah, it only takes a small amount of these self-replicating molecules to make it to another planet before, there was only one self-replicating molecule on Earth, or, but that's formed all of the life today. That could have happened many times, but there's one that's formed all of us.
Absolutely. So that's right. So when we talk about these things, we need to keep the idea of robustness and conservatism in mind, that the ideas we have should have as few if-thens as possible. And for example, my more immediate area of expertise is anthropology, and I didn't spend a lot of time looking at, forensic and physical anthropology, i.e. The fossil record on humans and hominids in general, but I do know a little bit about it. And so you may be aware that two of the dominant theories are out of Africa and dual origins theory. Now, dual origins theory, as it turns out, is quite popular in East Asia, and it comes up from time to time that some academy in China or wherever has said, oh, no, there were definitely dual origins. What is dual origins? Oh, well, basically that humans evolved twice. Now, just on the face of it, apparently there is a little bit of evidence to support this, a little bit. But it's ridiculous on the face of it, if you ask me. To explain humans arising once is a bit of a difficulty, let alone twice.
Yeah, and the idea that I won't dive into that, but yeah, I feel where you're coming from on that. But they've got 70 billion kilograms of rocks went into space 70 billion kilograms of rocks just from Earth when we got hit with an asteroid. And I'm talking about a planet covered in life that was before us, billions of years ago. That shot maybe even more life into space. So only a few have to reach each solar system, because if it gets on Earth, it's going to get to the rest of the solar system. So all it has to do is get to a solar system, and then the whole solar system is going to be contaminated eventually. So they put the odds at 50-50 that life on Mars is pretty much just life on Earth, continued on from a little journey across a little bit of space.
Yeah, which is a fascinating little thing, because I'm old enough to remember, Jordan, this might be a bit distant for you, but you may remember it being in the news. Basically, when we started sending, the more advanced probes to Mars to actually land on the surface and go around, sort of that adventure started about 20 years ago. And so we've sort of had a generation now of lander probes on Mars. And one of the things they kept telling us was, don't get too excited if we find evidence of life, because it could just be contamination from the Earth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So from that, I want to take the next step down the river. The next paddle is that let's just assume that I'm going to go with the safer option. Then I'm going to go for the more outrageous option. Is that how could life get from our solar system to another solar system? And I want you to imagine our solar system just being a solar system to a next one. Now, there's something called the Oort Cloud, which is essentially, if you imagine the solar system as a nice little bunch of planets, well, you're wrong. There's a whole ton of stuff whizzing around outside of that. That's just, it takes hundreds of millions of years to get around the Earth. It's really far away. But every once in a while, a bit of that comes into our nice little safe zone in the middle and goes in and out. So you might know that's where comets originate. That's where the far distant asteroids that could smash an Earth every couple of 100,000 years. That's where they originate. But the interesting thing about that is it's actually really huge, that cloud. And the thing is that this is think of a geological timescale of billions of years, that every 50,000 years a star passes within the Oort cloud. So every 50,000 years a different star comes within our cloud. So our cloud and their cloud combined to mix things. So things that could have been ejected from Earth or ejected from a planet can get, every 50,000 years we have a chance to hand off, here's a bit of life, or here's a bit of whatever.
Yeah, well, that's crazy, because I remember reading somewhere or hearing in a podcast, a sciencey thing about how often, basically how often solar systems went through each other. Like in the history of everything, like it may have happened quite a lot of times. And so this is quite exciting. So this is our Oort cloud, which is a relatively local to us, but as you say, also friggin' ginormous. And then other suns going through it, carrying all their planets with them.
Yeah, I mean, yes, everything with them. And some of, because this is an interesting area of research, because if you want to know what the early solar system had or what early Earth had, just go and find some evidence out there. You could find bits of Earth from the collision of the moon out there that haven't been that are identically chemically to the day they were smashed, because they were smashed out there. So and the reason that we've investigated this is that there's a star called Schultz star, which is 70,000 years ago, was the most recent star to go through our Oort cloud.
It's extremely recent.
So we might have even handed off life. I mean, 70,000 years ago, that's nothing, literally nothing.
Oh no, it's less than a blink of an eye.
Yeah, and think about, so every 50,000, even if you just went back to, say, the dinosaurs, which is like hundreds of millions of years.
So a foreign sun had been through the Oort cloud hundreds of times since the dinosaurs.
Yeah. So we have, if just the dinosaur, and this is such a small event in the history of the universe, that if we've sent life, we know that the Earth was covered in life at that time, because obviously there was dinosaurs on the damn thing. We've sent as parts of life to hundreds of different Oort clouds around hundreds of different stars just within our planet, and where our planet's like nothing in the the scope of things. So if our one planet can do it hundreds of times, let's imagine hundreds of planets doing it hundreds of times and passing it across.
Yeah. So actually, the interseeding of, as in the seeding going this way, not just coming to us, but going away from us as well, coming from us and coming to us. And picture, there's just an incredible amount of this going on.
Yeah, we don't. In our time scale, we're in a nice little safe spot of the universe or the galaxy, but we're actually just like whizzing around past everyone all the time. No one's going the same rate. We're going 100,000 kilometers an hour in a direction. Well, you only got to go a few different kilometers an hour, and eventually you'll pass by. After millions of years.
It's incredible. But it's making me feel dizzy thinking about it.
So they've got the suspicion is 20 stars will pass within a couple of light years of us just in a million years. So that's not much. A million years is like nothing, and they've got 700 stars will go within 15 light years of our solar system in the next 15 years. So if you think about the transferring of everything, 700 stars could be infected with Earth's galactic expunging of dinosaur, in that short amount of time.
Oh man, that's a lot. And there I was thinking that humans were making huge problems down here, spreading species around everywhere by accident all the time. Well, it turns out we might be doing it all over the joint.
Yeah. But one of the things I want to go down. So that was the small river I wanted to go down, where that's like we're handballing things to the next person and they're getting it, but it's really slow. What I want to go down the river of is a much more violent river, which is what happens if a planet explodes and it's like going fast. We've gone from like handing, to the next person. Now we're going to go boom and send it. So one of the most interesting that I think that people don't know about our solar system is that we're like a third generation star, which means that there's been a star, it's formed, it's had a solar system, it's had its whole life, and it's exploded. Then from that remnant, another thing's formed, it's had its whole life, and then it's exploded. So, and we could even be more, but we're at least a third. And you can tell that by the composition of our Earth, our sun, what colors it's burning, what it's made up of.
So the star has novaed and then recomposed at least twice.
Yeah, and the amount of distance would have been traveled from just one star having one nova that could send life into space is astronomical. Like that, now we're getting across galaxies. If you put a rock, if you put a rock next to the sun and exploded the sun, that parts of that rock will make other galaxies by now. So now we're talking about properly getting across the universe. So what kind of scale could that happen? Well, if you think about just the Earth, but I'm going to go back to early universe, which is not at all like ours, where suns evolved a lot quicker. If life just forms around and the universe is a lot smaller back then, a lot smaller by an infinite, expanding universe. But what the first galaxies were more closer together. You could more quickly send an exploding supernova of life from one galaxy to another. 4 billion years into the universe rather than 12 billion years into the universe. So that's the river I want to go down on that thing. So pretty much that's my hypothesis I'm gonna present of the idea of.
I think this is fertile territory because it sounds like there's an absolutely prodigious amount of interseeding going on potentially.
So so that's where I've gone with modern information. How could you connect those ancient ideas? That's what I've come up with. That we have, here's a system that's not too out of the realm of possibility for things to be transported from one place to another place. Over a million years.
We've definitely gotten around the difficult problem of how it's getting from here to there. That's right. Or from there to here. Yeah.
Yeah. So now this is the bit where we're going to stray away from the what's kind of hard and fast and go into perhaps a bit more gray area into
more speculative territory.